Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason Banshee, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How are you today, Joelle?
Jason, I was just bringing back some lunch in my car, and my music streaming service decided to throw up some George Michael into my feed. So it was having a nice little groove on the way back to work, and having a chuckle to myself as I remembered a concert of his that I went to, and these two middle-aged women who were sitting in front of me almost got into literal fisticuffs because one of them was standing on her chair and the other one couldn't see from behind and was like grabbing the back of her chair and shaking it, and she was almost falling off. And I think security actually had to intervene before these women who had paid a lot of money for the seats that they were in came to blows.
Yeah, okay.
Over George Michael. Yeah. who's not known was not known for his proclivities of the female variety.
Yeah, okay. Maybe they thought they were still an option. I don't know. Who knows what was going through their heads. It was amusing for me sitting right behind them. Yeah. Yeah. Nice little journey down memory lane there.
Yeah. It was a fun night.
I'm sure it was. Listeners won't realize this, but we actually just had a fantastic conversation with Tony Lamontagna just earlier this morning, and we've got actually another amazing guest to welcome on.
We do.
So we should probably welcome her in.
Yes.
So this person is a qualified organisational psychologist, like Joelle, not like me, with more than 10 years experience specialising in the design, delivery and evaluation of workplace psychological health strategies and services. She has worked with a range of organisations and sectors across the Asia Pacific to deliver services designed to proactively support and improve the wellbeing of individuals, prevent psychological injuries. She's currently the Chief Mental Health Officer at Commonwealth Bank. Welcome to the podcast, Dr Laura Kirby.
Thank you so much for having me. In good company.
Yes. So, Tony, amazing guest. We did talk about how big a boots you've got to fill.
And I refuse to fill them. Can we just lower that bar right back down before we start?
But you are, again, someone who's hard to nail down for one of these podcasts. So we have been chasing you, not quite as long as Tony, but pretty soon afterwards, I think we tried to do this. So really happy to finally get you on. It took a lockdown in Sydney to actually get you locked down into the house where we could finally get some of your time.
You do look for different things being in the presence of lockdown. You look for different outlets, and you guys are definitely a good way to use my brain over this period.
Yeah, it was so great to have you on.
Yes, we're happy to be a distraction for you.
Absolutely.
All right. So can you tell us about your favourite podcasts?
I love this question because I'm a huge consumer of podcasts, I have to say. My disclaimer there, though, is that this is probably the most educational podcast that I listen to.
Fine. And that you're allowed to be entertained. You don't have to be educated.
I was going for a comedy angle for this podcast.
Well, listen, I'm actually very excited when I saw your podcast come out, and I know I'm going to sound like every other guest that blows smoke, but it was one of those things where you start listening, you're like, yes, someone else is using the same language and the same terminology, and oh my God, this is amazing. And some fantastic guests very early on really set the scene. So it's been really helpful for me to have this, and it's been something I've referred others to just start to get them understanding this concept of psych health and safety and what does it mean. So it's been great to have that, but I for the most part, outside of this podcast, my listening is very much down the crime, real crime. I'm not alone in that one, I know, and there's been some great podcasts of late. I'm finally catching up on season 3 of Dr Death, which is now obviously hit with the TV reproduction of season 1. So I've got a ton of not safe for work recommendations around podcasts that if anyone needs a list of, I've got plenty.
Well, I'm glad you like our podcast. What are you doing next week?
Lockdown's meant to continue, so you know.
Yeah, home, I guess. Yeah.
All right, Laura. So can you tell us about your professional career, and in particular, you're an organisational psychologist. How do you end up being the chief mental health officer of a leading bank?
It's a great question, and it's definitely not one I would have foresaw when I started in org psych. So too many years ago to count, and I'm not going to disclose how many years. But when I started studying psychology, which was, fresh out of high school, went straight into uni, did the psych degree. It was really only at the end of my bachelor's degree that I even knew what org psych was. I think you go into psychology with a very sort of tunnel vision about what that means and what that looks like. So for me, it was really exciting to see that there are different avenues, and org psych really spoke to me, and it was something I was interested in. So then I entered into my master's and switched into the doctorate to do a Doctor of Organisational Psychology. And over that period, I wanted to get some practical skills. So actually one of the first roles that I did was in OC rehab while I was still studying, and sort of looked at the recovery aspect of psychology in workplaces. And that was I think a really fantastic foundation for me, or at least entry level into what it looks like and what are the sorts of things that we're dealing with from a workplace perspective, albeit from one particular lens. But then I was really fortunate as part of my training as a psych. As you know, you have to do a certain number of hours of practice and supervision. And one of the practice elements I did was with a very small consultancy firm. And they really focused on consulting to medium to large organizations who needed assistance with embedding and supporting their workplace mental health strategies. And it was with that particular consultancy that I ended up staying for over a decade and became a partner and director of. And so I was really fortunate over that period to consult with a huge array of organizations, locally, nationally, and internationally as well. So that was a huge foundation for me in terms of working with different organizations with different struggles at different levels of the maturity scale, and really seeing the whole field grow. I think you can imagine 10 years ago, the workplace mental health space was a very different space, and it wasn't, we weren't talking about the same things. It was very much in its infancy. I think even the discussion of mental health more broadly from a community perspective was in its infancy back then. So to be a part of that and see it grow exponentially over that period, in some cases for better and in some cases for worse, because this is a heavily populated space now. But yeah, it gave me some really, really fantastic skills and opportunities to develop that ability to work with organizations to work out what it is they need and what they want. So it was that consulting background that then led me into the opportunity to work internally with a large organization as the need or the recognition for better practices, particularly around psychological health and safety, was recognised. And so that's where I started in the role at CB8. So it's only a new role, and I only recently started the beginning of the year, and what a time to start in the middle of a lockdown. But actually I think as an org psych, you definitely become more in demand over this period to help understand that merging of individual mental health and workplace mental health. And what does that mean, and how do we look at work differently? And if people are working more remotely, what does that mean for us? And how do we design work in a way that engages people and still enables them to experience positive mental health through their work? So yeah, it's definitely been an interesting journey, and certainly one that is continuing to evolve and pave ahead of me.
Interesting stuff. Yeah, it has, I think, for org psychs going through this sort of the last 18 months in particular, I think the lens and how we view the way that work is organised, I feel like this has been a particularly interesting time for us as a profession, sort of experiencing what this is like as a worker, as well as sort of observing it with our professional goggles on. So, and I also started my first week here was we were in a snap lockdown. So did my first week working remotely. So that was interesting.
Yeah, if you go back to some of the old videos, you'll see us doing the podcast from home.
Yeah.
Luckily it was only a short one.
It was just that 1 week. So yeah, not too bad.
Yeah. Now, Laura, interesting, to see that evolution right from external consultant into this internal role within a large bank. You've got the title Chief Mental Health Officer, and I know there's another person working at a large bank who you know well, Dave Burrows, who also has that same title. What's the rationale behind that title, right? Like, because you could come in at any kind of title. Like, why did they decide to give you that title, Chief Mental Health Officer?
Good question, and I'm not sure that I can answer directly on behalf of the people who set those roles up, but I certainly think a couple of things that go into the thinking. One is around articulating specifically mental health and recognizing it as an important component of work. So I think it's a great initiative that we're actually having dedicated roles in the space of workplace mental health. And particularly where we're aligning those roles with more of the psych health and safety elements. And so one of the things that we did early on to differentiate the position, at least internally, was helping people understand that it was a strategic based role as opposed to this is now our chief internal counsellor, because I'm a horrible counsellor. I don't profess to have those skills. And so it's making it clear that this is part of the ongoing strategy around workplace mental health and in particular looking at the prevention arm of that space. And there's also in thinking about a large organization, a certain element of hierarchy that can't be avoided when you've got a huge number of people being employed. And I think to have the seat at the right table and have the voices that you need to hear you, there is, I think, a good reason to have them positioned at a certain level in that hierarchy. So it's not necessarily a title that I wheeled out, but I certainly think it has helped me to meet the right people and have the right conversations, because so much of what we need to do and so much of the influence we need to have is right the way through that organization, from the very top through to the very front line. So I think that certainly helps with getting stuff done and getting heard.
Yeah, no, it sounds like a very good strategic move. And like you say, differentiating between the strategy versus, say, the operational or the appearance of an internal employee assistance provider, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, your previous role in consultancy obviously focused heavily around psychological health and safety and psychosocial risk management. And, you know, you obviously have that lens in this new role, looking, I guess, more at the work determinants, the psychosocial risks or factors associated with mental health outcomes as compared to, say, the social determinants or the individual determinants of mental health. I guess that's a way to put it. So thinking about banking and finance in particular, in the time that you spent in there, both as an external consultant and now internally, what are some of the key psychosocial hazards that you would say exist?
You look at any psych risk framework, you name it, it's on there. And part of the reason for that, I think if you think about some of the large organizations in this sector, we're talking about very large organizations in global settings, and therefore a huge array and variation in terms of roles and responsibilities. And with that means that we've got a huge variety in hazards across the group, across the organization. So, you know, you think about your very frontline and customer facing roles who inherently have risks associated with workplace behaviours around violence and aggression, etc., that were always there. But then you add the extra layer of COVID-19 and lockdown pressures, and we're now seeing them deal with those sorts of risks much more frequently. We're also dealing much more with increased cases around customer vulnerability, where financial wellbeing is an issue. And we've got dedicated teams who are responsible for supporting those people and linking them into appropriate access for services and support. So those are some of the ones that already existed but have been exacerbated by some of the pressures that we're currently facing. Then you've got whole teams who, again, if you're thinking about lockdown context, are now transitioning to working from home. And that's actually, I think, been one of the major I guess, accelerators for looking at psych risk, because people are now realizing that there are mental health impacts of being in prolonged lockdowns and working from home and being removed from your normal workplace supports, or even things like having a dedicated workplace environment to do your work, and therefore work-life interface and good work-life separation or work-life boundaries is a real challenge for people. And that's being faced by everyone, particularly in corporate settings, but also some of those customer-facing roles who are very reliant on peer support and peer networks that have been removed from those networks because they're not able to access them in the normal workplace environment. You've got, I think, I'm yet to meet any organisation, irrespective of sector, where work overload and role overload are issues, and constantly working through things like role clarity. So I think if you look at any of those standard hazard frameworks, you've got all of those risks captured in different ways across the roles in the organisation. And I guess this is one of the challenges when you think about the larger organisations in this space, is that we are having to look at psych risk in the way that it affects individual teams or business units. It's, we can use the same framework, and that's one of the bits that we can apply broadly, but how that's affecting teams and how we can therefore control some of those risks looks very different. It requires a lot of in-depth sort of consultation and investigation around what that looks like and what are the sorts of things we're really trying to control here.
Yeah, interesting what you say there regarding how the hazards are kind of the same across, in banking and finance as in many industries. I think the one about, potential vicarious trauma for people who are on the phone with people who are in a bad situation, you can definitely understand how that would be exacerbated during a pandemic. And I guess working in banking and finance, you wouldn't typically associate vicarious trauma as one of the key hazards. But for the people in those roles dealing with people under financial duress, I could imagine that would be a big one.
Absolutely. And vicarious trauma in particular is one risk that's really been brought to the forefront over the last 12 to 18 months around issues of financial wellbeing, domestic and family violence support. And as I said, there are teams whose entire role is dedicated to supporting individuals who are experiencing those sorts of issues. And whilst they're not supporting them from a care or counselling perspective, they being called, they're talking with these people in very vulnerable situations in points of time of which need is very high, and they have to be ready to be able to point them in the right direction, engage the right support for them. And so there has been a huge program of work undertaken to really look at the vicarious trauma risk and how we support people in those roles, from sort of minimising exposure where we can, and then having the right support networks in place in the context of when these teams are also working remotely, which, when you're engaging things like peer support and other debriefing opportunities that are really important from a recovery perspective, we have to look at doing them differently. Yeah.
Another thing that you mentioned that I'd love to drill into a little bit more, in this social experiment, which we're calling the New South Wales lockdown, what we're seeing is people are working from home, right? And they're obviously being exposed to similar hazards, like those psych hazards, like they would in the workplace, whether that be workload, lack of autonomy, lack of role clarity, poor change management practices, organisational justice. And we see a lot of workplaces actually, if we think about demands and supports, often when there are people are having an adverse stress reaction, they try and build up the supports rather than reduce the demand. So we look at things like perks, like the old table tennis table, or having healthy food options, encouraging people to do physical activity, mental health apps, that sort of thing. But I'm wondering if, because people are in lockdown, they're not necessarily able to access all of those same supports that would be buffers of that stress response. But they're still having the same demands that haven't been reduced. So I'm wondering if you think that might be something that's contributing to, this maybe an adverse mental health reaction from people in isolation.
Yeah, of course. And I think things like risk of greater ambiguity and less role clarity, purely because we don't have the opportunity to walk past someone and think, oh, this might be a really good chance just to check in, or have some of those organic conversations where we're able to check priorities. In the Microsoft Teams environment or Zoom, whatever the tool is, everything has to be scheduled. So you just don't have those natural abilities to check in, clarify conversations, even sort of team-based initiatives are done differently. And we, the psychology of interacting in a virtual environment versus in a face-to-face environment, it's done differently. Our brains operate differently. So I think it is challenging some of those natural resources that are just better equipped in a face-to-face workplace environment than it is in a virtual work environment. So I think there's a couple of things there. I think some of the stuff that we know is important and works naturally happens less in the virtual environment. And then some of the buffering stuff that we rely on too inherently isn't available for people. And, I'm particularly conscious of those in customer facing roles when working from home. That if they've got kids at home and the risk of vicarious trauma, how that extends to family members, how we're protecting the whole unit of where people are operating from that we have naturally less control over. So there are things that we're really mindful of in terms of how we're providing more of the social and the debriefing peer support in those networks so that we're protecting the space in which people are working socially and physically. So it's a really challenging time, I think, from that front and thinking about not just how we're buffering this, but what are the things that we can do in this virtual environment that's legitimately going to make a difference, given that we recognize likely the emotional demands that people are experiencing are much higher than they have been in the past.
Yeah, we have spoken about it previously on this podcast with the demands and resources model, how a lot of companies just go into, well, we're not going to reduce the demand, so we're just going to add more and more supports. But I'm just wondering now in this state of isolation whether that strategy is not going to work anymore, and because we don't have the access to the same level of support, even though it sounds like you're doing some great work with your employee workforce. But at some point we do have to actually start looking at what are we actually going to do to reduce some of these demands.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a conversation that is happening. I think it's probably in its infancy. And certainly in New South Wales, I think the challenge we had was very early on. We kind of thought it was just 2 weeks and then we'd be out of it. And we're 10, I don't even know how many weeks we are down the track. And, I worry about organisations that haven't pivoted, therefore, and are having those conversations, checking whether people are feeling overloaded and therefore do we need to deprioritise or reprioritise. So it is a conversation that's happening. I think we're relying on leaders to have those conversations. So whether leaders are equipped or not, or even have the capacity themselves to make space for these conversations. And again, I think the virtual environment makes that more difficult because to get into a leader's diary, they're back to back already. So either we're hoping that they're having these conversations in a regular one-on-one, or when new work items come through the door, that they're proactively prioritizing that for people and structuring the demands more effectively. Or we've got good voice at the senior level instructing people to take ownership, and this is where things around the job crafting can be really important in helping individuals recognise the role that they play in managing those demands and speaking up around those demands. I know something I've been really conscious of, at least with my organisation over the last few weeks, is the impact that, when you talk about structuring your day in a remote or virtual work environment, if we don't give people the space to have focus time or take breaks between meetings, and therefore the brain is already feeling overloaded before they move on to the next thing, we're setting them up for failure. So simple things around meeting structures or reducing meeting times, creating meeting-free times are really important in a remote environment so that we can give people automatically the space to either do the work that they need to do or step away and refresh before they move on to the next thing. So again, it's things that we wouldn't necessarily think about until moving whole workforces into work from home environments.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting practical thing that organizations can do, just that freedom to say, I'm not taking a meeting, I'm going to have focused attention on the job that I'm actually paid to do. When we look at the workload issue, often it is caused by the fact that people don't have time to focus on their actual job and they're just expected to attend meeting after meeting. And so that's why they often will come in on a weekend or, whatever in order to get their job done because they're caught up in meetings throughout the week.
Exactly.
I really, so we have called out the fact that, you know, companies that have gotten on this whole, everyone's burnt out, let's just give them a week off. You know, there could be an issue with that, in that if they're not addressing the systemic issues that were causing people to burn out in the first place, like not having enough focused time on work and spending too much time on meetings, they're just going to come back to those same issues, and it's just going to, you know, and maybe even have even more workload build up on their week off, and it's going to cause more issues. But I do want to call out Canva. I did see Canva had introduced a meeting-free Wednesday, which I think is a fantastic initiative, which is actually sustainable, to give people that focused time on their job.
Yeah, the meeting-free Friday has been popular in my area of work, and it's a good way for people to clear their desk before the weekend. So Fridays are great because people sort of, you know, need that chance to clear the to-do list that's continually built up over that week, and they can head into the weekend with a clear mind, and they don't feel like they're carrying all of this extra stuff that they then have to switch back on non-working days. So it doesn't really matter what day of the week it is, but that just happens to have been popular for people. And I think when you've got part-time workers, often Fridays not being a day of work either, so it potentially works for more of the organisation. But this, you know, I think there's the mandating to support versus, you know, equipping teams with working out what operational method works for them, but encouraging those opportunities to have the meeting-free time or the focus time or whatever you call it. I know people are feeling really refreshed from having a regular opportunity just to do their work, and leaders in particular, because they're the ones that are most prone to the Zoom fatigue or the back-to-back meetings than anyone. They still need to do their work. So giving them space to do it as well.
Very interesting stuff. And we could probably just keep talking about this sort of stuff forever. I'd like to ask you a little bit more about, I guess, the banking and financial industry, and the state of mental health or workplace mental health in the industry. And I'm thinking a little bit about the, was it a Royal Commission a couple of years ago? It was a Royal, yeah. And obviously that was really focused on, I guess, outcomes for customers, but then, you know, was sort of looking at the culture within banking and finance. I mean, for me, there's very clear links between that sort of culture of, you know, pushing for sales and profits and the practices that are required to meet those cultural expectations, and how they might be at odds with, I guess, people's values, and the impact that can have on mental health. Is that something that the industry has sort of reflected on post-inquiry?
With the organisations that I've been working on, certainly, it's been a huge focus, and particularly the call out around culture and ethical cultures, speak up, psychological safety as opposed to psychological health and safety, are definitely themes that are of huge focus. And I think when it comes to the psychological health and safety, there's kind of a double-edged sword here, if you will, in that culture and other risks are being identified as important. We need to make links to make sure that we are building the right environment for people to succeed in a way that is helpful in terms of outputs for customers, communities, etc. And to that end, I think there's been a lot of work done around values and the behaviours that are engaged, or as I heard it referred to yesterday, as the execution performance as opposed to technical performance. And I think there's some really good examples in this industry where behaviours and values are being put at the forefront in terms of how we're assessing how people are performing. So I think from that perspective, there's been huge movement. I think the double-edged sword when it comes to psych health and safety, though, is that through the integration lens around risk. So the way that we talk about risk and fast learning is different to how other areas of the industry talk about risk. And if I could just break it down into something as simple as financial risk versus non-financial risk. The financial risk in a banking and finance sector is the number one, and how we're making sure that what we're doing meets all the code, legislate, all the rest of it. But then the non-financial risk, which is the people risk and the psych health and safety risk and those sorts of things, we're trying to integrate them into the same sort of frameworks or language around financial risk. And the two don't necessarily always speak the same language. So for me, it's been a really interesting lesson, and it's one that I'm continuing to learn about. Well, what does integration actually look like in this space? And how do we talk to psych health and safety in a way that's going to be understood? So I think at a high level, people risk and non-financial risk is definitely something that's being held to light and supported in making sure that we're doing the right things. But it might mean that we're having to adapt our language differently or measure it differently so that we can make sure that it's happening the way that we want it to happen, in the way that we understand risk and control, which is a bit different, if that makes sense.
This
now,
is
Joelle's been having this discussion with the mining
yeah,
company at the moment.
So it's, I guess, a different risk lens, but, you know, for them, looking at, you know, sort of major hazard risk and the way that they conceptualize that, the way that they approach modeling and control, you know, we can make great analogies with psych health and safety and, you know, major accident event prevention, in terms of that we need to understand, you know, when we talk about hazards, they understand what that means. When we talk about control measures and mitigations, they understand what that means. But then it's about, okay, this is the methodology that we use. How can that work then when we're talking about psych health and safety? So this is, I guess, what you're experiencing there, in terms of there's, you know, some commonalities in terms of approach and language, but there's also some really, it's sort of almost clashing in terms of how can we actually find a way to integrate these things, or is it going to need to be a separate process? And obviously there's a big push against, no, we don't want another process. We want it to integrate, but you can't integrate for the sake of integration if it's not going to work.
Exactly. And so there's this, you know, operating in a very large organization where you've got system upon system and a regulated way in which we address certain things. So, you know, being an org psych, we didn't learn this stuff. This is a whole new ballgame. And this is what I mean about the opportunity to work with different organizations, and particularly from an internal perspective. This is one of the challenges, is how do you get this to stick, and how do you get this to integrate in a way that's going to be meaningful, and you make sure that it's being applied in the way that you intend it to be applied. And it's easier when you get to talk to people. I think when you're speaking with people about what this means, and you can educate and we can sort of get on the same page about how this applies, then fine. But it's just that the system integration makes it a bit trickier. I think there's still definitely room to grow in that space.
Yeah, it sounds like it's something that every industry is going to be grappling with. You know, how does this, where does it fit and where does it not fit, and what, I guess, what are the bridges that we need to build?
Yeah, well, Joelle, I'd actually think our listeners would benefit from hearing some of the commentary you made when we've been doing some of this consulting with this mining company about that difference between the top-down, bottom-up approaches. Yeah,
okay. So, and I don't know how relevant this is to the finance industry. You can just listen and pipe up if you want to. So I guess, so if you're looking at major accident hazards and how those are typically assessed in resource industries, it tends to be a very top-down process. So we'll look at, we're going to, you know, in this facility or on this site, we're going to conduct these particular activities. And we know that these activities are associated with these particular physical or health hazards. And because we know what the consequences of those hazards are for people, and we know what control measures we can put in place, therefore we can reduce the risk associated with that hazard to a level that is largely acceptable. The issue for psychosocial hazards is that they are always there. It doesn't matter what activity you're doing, as long as you've got a group of people together, working together in an organization, you're going to have those psychosocial hazards present. And it's a matter of what are the contextual factors that actually contribute to those psychosocial hazards emerging and causing distress for people as well. So it's not just that they're present, but that they're actually creating risk. And you really can't analyze that in any meaningful way from a top-down approach, other than to say, yes, they're going to be there. And so I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I'm sort of thinking about, well, you know, what else is something that's sort of endemic and just always there, and you don't know when it's going to pop up. Corrosion. You know, corrosion is probably a pretty good example. And if you've got pressure vessels, for example, you don't know what's going on inside them. You know that they've got the potential for corrosion, and you know that if they do corrode, things can go catastrophically wrong depending on, you know, what they're containing, and what else is around. And so, yeah, you can do some estimates of, you know, what are the likely rates of corrosion based on, you know, the makeup of the pressure vessel, and, you know, the whatever it's containing, and thickness and all of those types of things. But ultimately, you know, if you want to get an accurate picture of the state of corrosion, you need to do regular inspection and monitoring. And I think that's sort of where I'm getting to in finding the links between these different processes, is that, you know, yes, you need to assess your system, your plant, for corrosion. You need to monitor the state of corrosion in your plant and equipment. And then you need to, when you find that there is corrosion that's getting to a dangerous level, then you put a plan in place to address it. And I think it's sort of similar from a psych hazard perspective, that you need to assess, and you need to monitor, and you need to take action where you're seeing that those hazards are creating risk for the workforce.
Yeah. So I think you said in your example that the monitoring could actually be considered a control.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it is considered a control. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So hearing that example, Laura, have you been able to draw any similar parallels when looking at financial risk? And that's, I guess, how the banking industry want to kind of conceptualize psychological health and safety risk.
Yeah, well, I think it's one of the ways that we can make sure that we are regularly monitoring and assessing, which I think in any industry there hasn't necessarily been a great history of psychosocial hazards being regularly assessed or, you know, managed in the way that we're talking about it now. So yeah, I think with the organizations that I'm working with, no one's saying that, oh, we shouldn't be doing this stuff. It's just, how do we record it in a way that we are capturing it, that people understand that it's part of their obligations, and we're putting it sort of on the same platform as we would any other risk in the business. It's just that the language needs to change a bit. So certainly in some instances, the monitoring would be the control. And so that bit makes sense. And people can say that by us having the regular consultation, regular assessment, that's part of us saying we're controlling it by having those points in and looking at what's happening. And then on the back of that, we might have some additional specific controls depending on what's being raised in that monitoring system. So yeah, I think there's definitely parallels in being able to translate what we're talking about as far as risk goes into what the system, or the sort of the boxes we're trying to fit it into from that risk lens makes sense, and they can come together. So it's just, I think it's more than anything, it's probably just a language or a system issue. But if we talk about integration, it's one that we have to address, and we have to understand how to bring it together so that we are putting it on the same platform as any other risk in business.
I'm actually interested in your commentary on, I mean, ISO 45003 obviously is the international standard for psych health and safety at work, and it's a child standard to 45001 for occupational health and safety management systems. So there really is a push to put workplace mental health more under that risk lens, under the safety management system.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are less physical hazards in banking and finance than, say, in resources and mining or construction. And like you say, more of the risk focus is around the financial risks. What is the state of, say, safety management systems, and what would be the appropriateness of putting workplace mental health under a safety management system in banking and finance?
Well, we're going through that process at the moment, so it definitely makes sense. But once again, sort of the typical health and safety systems or management systems are different again to what the risk control systems are. So we're trying to have to fit all of the WHS risks or hazard assessments into a different box. So it's not a conversation I'm having alone. Actually, it's one that holistically as WHS we're trying to navigate and manage. But I think I've been really lucky at the point in time in which I've come into the bank. There's been a piece of work in looking at upgrading that, the WHS risk register and hazard assessment. And so I've been able to, build in the psychological health and safety risks or psychosocial hazards into that approach. So I think it's less of a bridge to gap in terms of building into the WHS. Ironically, it's more about holistically, how do we get the WHS system into the rest of what we talk about around risk control. So it's just, I think my reflection on that though is, I think it speaks to the maturity, at least, of what we're having this conversation. And I think that's one thing that I've been impressed with the industry, is that as far as the maturity goes, we're well past the foundations. I think the organisations in this space openly recognise that, simple things like good work is good for people, that, workplace mental health operates on a continuum, and that we should be taking a 5 and 5 approach as opposed to a 1 and 5 approach. And we're not just talking about mental illness when we talk about mental health, that work is a protective factor for people. So I think we're building on some very strong foundations, and certainly I think the foundations around promotion and illness management are solid. I think there's been some fantastic practices in that place for a while. It's now just that we're getting headway into the prevention space, that these new conversations are happening, and we're looking at, well, how do we do this, and how do we achieve good integration around those factors? So I think from that, these are great problems to have if this is the maturity of the conversation that we're having around getting it integrated.
Yeah, that's fantastic news. And obviously, like a lot of large Australian banks, the Commonwealth Bank is headquartered in Sydney. Obviously, the Code of Practice for Psych Health and Safety at Work came out recently in New South Wales. Has that prompted any further action or focus from the banking and finance sectors?
Look, I think more broadly for the sector, that was recognised as a really helpful guide. And I think it's been a fantastic resource for all organisations to leverage. And I think if we look at that code of practice as a minimum standard, so not necessarily as something that we hold people to, but as an expectation that we would have organisations have at minimum this level of rigour around their psychosocial hazard practices, that's been hugely beneficial. So I don't see it's necessarily a New South Wales specific impact that it's had. It's more broadly for all workplaces, particularly large ones who are already working in this space, to hold them to more account around what are we doing. I think we were lucky in the sense that I was already in the business, so there was a level of expertise that at least we now had in-house. I'd already updated our registers and starting to have these conversations around, when are we assessing risk? How do we do that? What does that look like? How do we support business units and making sure that they are aware of the hazards, and therefore what other controls, for lack of a better term, we need to be putting in place. So I think, if anything, it's kind of helped reinforce the need for internal experts, or the utility of internal experts, at least, in this space, if this is where we're going to hold organisations accountable for. I certainly have seen too that alongside the release of that report, the conversation around more formal psychosocial risk assessment has certainly increased as well. And this is probably something you guys have had much greater contact with. But as an example, one of the organisations that CBA is a part of is the Corporate Mental Health Alliance. And I know you've spoken to this alliance before, but one of the key working groups in that space, in that alliance, is around psychosocial risk. And so hearing from other organisations within this sector and other sectors around what they're doing to assess these risks, get a baseline measure, if we haven't measured this before, around psychosocial hazards, and look at some of the even case studies around what people are doing, what their findings were, what have they implemented on the back of it. I think it's been a conversation to a new level. So, in my consulting days, we've been talking about this for years, but the movement that I've seen in just the last 6 months on this space has been incredibly huge compared to previous years.
Yeah, there's definitely been a groundswell. I mean, it's just been a number of things after each other, right? So we had, the Boland Review and the WHS ministers taking into account that and looking at updating regulations to deal with psychological injury. You got the ISO 45003 standard that came out in June. You got these various codes of practice that have either come out already in New South Wales or are in draft or about to be released in draft format from the other regulators in the other states. So there's a lot of drivers for it, and it's like yourself, having worked in this space for a number of years, it's really quite an exciting time for people working in psych health and safety.
Absolutely. It's not new, as we know. It's funny because I'm saying exactly the same things that I was saying a number of years ago. It's just people are paying more attention, or we get it now, or we're actually dedicating greater resources to this, and we're being more rigorous in the way that we're assessing it. And I think we're definitely moving away from looking at risk registers where mental health is listed as the hazard, and it's like, come on, let's look at this. So I think, the conversation has definitely changed and moved towards a much more, I think, proactive and preventative area, which is where it's designed to be. So I think it's been great from that perspective.
Yeah, and as you say, people are getting more aware about the need to risk assess psych hazards. I was having a chat with Peter Kelly earlier this week on his regular Zoom coffee catch-ups, and he was talking about the regulations over there. And he commonly talks to Regulation 3 and Regulation 5 in their health and safety legislation. Regulation 3 about assessing risks, and it looks like some companies are starting to do that. And obviously we've got mirror kind of standards in our own act. And regulations. And then the other part, though, that a lot of people forget to do is when you've identified a hazard, then you actually have to mitigate it, and you have to document how you're going to control these risks. So I guess you're saying that people are getting into that risk assessment kind of mindset. You need to assess these, and we need to get some baseline measures. Baseline measures are great, but what are we actually going to do about identified risks? Now, one other thing that came up before I let you jump in on this, Laura, is he also mentioned another regulation that he's actually just really starting to hone in on, and that is Regulation 10 over in their Act. And Joel could probably tell us what the corresponding legislation is over here, or regulation. And that's about if you have not reduced the risk of an identified hazard to a low enough level, you need to communicate that to your employees and let them know, not just to business units, as you were mentioning before, but down to the employee level. These are the hazards that are present that we have not got controls in place for.
So my experience as a regulator was within a very specific act that was focused on a very particular industry. So every state and territory in Australia has a different WHS Act.
I'm not putting you on the spot, Joelle. I only heard this the last couple of nights. I'll let you go and do some research. And maybe,
I actually don't know if there is an equivalent reg in Australia.
Yeah, but quite interesting, particularly for our UK audience then.
Yeah.
It's part of your legislation. It's not just the mandate that you need to risk assess and you need to control identified risks, but if you haven't, you need to let employees know what risks that you're allowing them to be exposed to.
Yeah. Like, I think to your point, the assessment is one thing, and there's a lot of efforts going into the assessment piece for a lot of organisations. And I've openly said that that's the easy part. As hard as that part is to get, depending on how people are doing it, whole of organisation consultation or survey or whatever that may be, that in theory is the easy part. It's the what we do with that on the back of it. And that becomes even more complex when you talk about an organisation that has such a variety of roles and hazards and the way that they play out. So I think this is where we can't get past things like consultation and valuing the ability to go and speak with people about, okay, so we recognise that this might be the hazard, but what does that actually mean? And on top of that, what do we do? What are some of the solutions that you think would actually help with this? And this is where I think conversations even around things like work overload, often, you go in and talk with organisations and everyone acknowledges work overload's an issue. We need more FTE. And, that's not always an agreeable answer. It's not realistic. We're not going to get that. So in lieu of additional FTE, what are the resources? And is it actually that people don't have enough clarity? Is it actually that people aren't managing the switch off or having enough breaks in their day to feel replenished and therefore move on to the next? So I think the ability to get to that granular, what's the root cause issues, what's the root cause factors, and realistically, what are the practical strategies we can implement here? We can't do that in the absence of actually hearing from people and doing that next bit, which is a whole nother piece of work. And then obviously seeing the controls through and making sure that they're working, etc. So yeah, I do think as much as the conversation has progressed and this whole idea of psych risk assessment has become much more ingrained and people are getting it, I think the looking ahead and what does that actually mean, what do we do with this is we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, well, there's a whole other bit there as well that you just mentioned, which is the monitoring bit. So a lot of them go, oh, we'll just use this free, online survey to assess our risks. And, that's great. We'll come up with some action items at like a HR level, like our employee engagement survey, and we'll determine some global level interventions for the organization. And then we'll run the survey again and see if, things have changed. We'll do that in 12 months time. Like, well, you wait 12 months to work out if your controls have been effective and whether you have actually reduced these risks to a low enough level. It's, it's like you say, it's great that we're having these discussions and we're starting to have the right discussions, but there's definitely a lot of maturity around the approach that's still required.
And I think what I keep coming back to in a lot of these conversations we've been having is the importance of line managers because, yes, you're going to have some global control measures, but, you've got different teams, different functions that are going to have different risk profiles, and the control measures are going to need to be tailored to those teams and to those professional groups or, whatever it is. So the role of the line manager in actually proactively managing the risk for that group or whatever that group is becomes so much more important.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you talk sort of large global organization, there's actually not that many from a psych risk perspective that I would say would be global controls. There are certain elements, and there's certainly some promotional and illness management elements that are 100% global controls. But in terms of some of the detail or the granularity around the psych hazards, it looks different from one contact center environment to another contact center environment. So it does rely on sort of getting down the layers to the right level in terms of line managers, in terms of that employee consultation, to know what that actually looks like and what we need to do differently. And so that's why I think we all know, it's definitely not a one size fits all approach, but it's also very involved when you start to look at much larger organizations, much more disparate organizations.
Yeah, we're just having this discussion with a large multinational recently, and they approached us around risk assessment and wanted to maybe even just run a half-day workshop, doing a very much top-down approach where we go, okay, let's consider the hazards. We'll have a few employer representatives from our 16 different locations come in, and we'll work out what the key psych hazards are, and we'll come up with our control strategies that will go into our risk register. We're like, hang on, do you yeah, that's great, but do you actually think that's going to help you to identify the risks at all these different locations and what is actually going to be effective in mitigating those risks at those locations? Wouldn't you be better off having an action plan for each location that the leader of that organization or of that location is actually responsible for actioning? And so, yeah, like Joel said, we've been talking a lot about the line manager level and, equipping them with support, obviously, from HR and OHS to be able to have these conversations about psych factors with their employees and then have them responsible for having an action plan for their team versus just following, this is the global one that we're following, if you like, and we're going to run mental health awareness training and promote the EAP.
Yeah, but it needs to be supported by policy from the different functional control areas, and I think the policy needs to be have sufficient sort of flexibility built into it that that line managers can apply it in a way that is sensible for the context, which is really quite a significant step away from the sort of command and control approach that especially a lot of those major hazard organisations take in terms of risk control.
Mm.
Absolutely. Very similar in this setting. And I think at least my experience is there is a willingness to engage autonomy at all levels so that people have the capacity to interpret it in the way that they need to or apply the things that they need to, which I think is a huge benefit in being able to establish the right control measures. And obviously, the larger the organisation, the more support there is. So there's huge layers of HR that can help support business units in what that might look like, or leverage existing procedures or approaches and apply it across different groups where it might be relevant. So I think there is opportunity in large organisations that obviously aren't afforded to smaller organisations, where we can leverage that expertise and leverage the application in different spaces.
But I think pros and cons probably. You've got more access potentially to sort of expertise and support in the larger organisations, but in the smaller organisations, you've got much more capacity for sort of flexibility and change and movement.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right, back to our agenda.
That was a bit of a detour.
All right. Let's talk about when you worked with David Burrows in your consultancy. How are you finding it working internally rather than as an external consultant?
Good question. This was actually one of the challenges that prompted me to take up the opportunity for an internal position. And in particular, in such a large organisation where I foresaw that there would be a number of challenges in implementing things. And so, I love a good challenge, competitive person, and I wanted to stretch myself in that capacity. So I think in many ways as a consultant, a lot of the hard work is done before you step in, because there's been obviously an agreed budget, an agreed agenda. They recognise the need for something. So you don't have to sell it once you're in. And I think there's a layer of, well, if it's an external expert, that there's a certain level of
credibility.
Yeah, credibility already given to that, that you don't have to sort of sell internally. The difference is, obviously with the external consulting, you hand it over and you go, okay, this is what you need to do, and you kind of hope that they do it, or they come back to you with pieces if they don't. So that was for me, with the possibility of being able to have greater impact and see positive change. And, with a large organisation, the impact then is quite significant, over 50,000 employees, and then by extension, customers, communities, etc. So I think the challenge and the opportunity to not just hope that it gets done, but actually to be part of the doing and be part of the cog and wheel that affects the change and moves it in a positive direction. Not saying I've done any of those things, but that was the sort of the pipeline dream or goal with taking that opportunity up. So in some ways it's easy. You don't have to do the upfront selling before you get in the door, but certainly helping to help people understand why we need to do this and how we do these things differently, and then fit them into existing systems and procedures is a real challenge. And so that's one thing, we talked earlier about the integration piece. I have a better understanding of what integration means now, but that also means I know how difficult it is and the hurdles I've got to face to actually make sure that it's properly integrated. So there's some of the challenges and the differences. And it's a huge growth opportunity for me, having spent so long in consulting. It really, putting on a different hat. And I see it as, I feel very grateful to have the opportunity in this role, not just from an impact perspective, but also to be able to have conversations open. We see, what is this evidence-based? Because there's so much stuff that can come into large organizations that sound like a great idea. They're a great pitch. They look really pretty on paper. And to be able to have the background knowledge and expertise to be able to say, actually, I don't think there's good evidence base for this, or I don't think this is going to be a good fit, or we're really just replicating something that we've already got available. I think that's been a beneficial part of being the internal journey as well.
Yeah, I've obviously come from an internal role, and that was actually one of my maliciously favourite things to do when I was there. When we'd have a consultant come in and try to sell something to the agency, and I'd ask them some tricky questions about the research behind their products and watch them sweat bullets.
But even a lot of these things that say that they're evidence-based or they have a large amount of research behind it, like mindfulness practice or resilience training programs, that's great. But if you're putting something that's evidence-based in without the consultation piece, it doesn't really matter how much evidence there is, clinical evidence, if it doesn't meet the context and the needs of the organisation. So I think we often miss that consultation piece and actually work out, what do people want? Oh, we're going to sell them a mindfulness app, but really, you know what? They just want a bit more focused time to actually do their job. They don't need mindfulness.
Well, and if they don't have enough time to do their job, then how are they going to find time to fit mindfulness into their day?
Right. Maybe they'll be more productive, and so they'll get their job done quicker in the limited time they've got.
Yeah, it's just a vicious circle.
So yeah, no, I don't like these solutions for solution's sake. We're very much obviously of the opinion that you do all your work in the consultation phase, and then the solutions kind of reveal themselves. This has been a really great discussion with you, Laura. You haven't disappointed.
Oh gosh, thank you.
One thing, because we have been waiting a while to get you on, so I'm not going to let you off just yet. You did mention the Corporate Mental Health Alliance, right? Now, this is kind of an insular group. This is made up by companies within Australian corporates, if you like. So you wouldn't be able to get a look in as a consultant ordinarily. You're now working as an internal in an organisation. Could you tell us and our listeners a little bit more about the Corporate Mental Health Alliance and I guess what you're finding beneficial about being involved, putting your Commonwealth Bank hat on?
Look, I think more than anything, the approach that's been taken to the Alliance in terms of sharing what people are doing in this space, I think that's the intended and the actual benefit of something like this. And it's not to say that everyone should be doing it in a particular way. I think if anything, it's taught that different organisations will approach this whole space differently, but still get good outcomes or good results because they're doing what works for their business or doing it in a way that's going to work for their people. So, I think it's a really great initiative to ensure and I guess hold involved corporates to a standard that we're actually going to focus properly on psychological health and safety. And what does that mean? What does workplace mental health mean in corporate Australia? And down the track, how do then we influence more broadly how we're approaching workplace mental health from a corporate perspective? So, yeah, I think the initiative around sharing and learning from others what we're doing and identifying key focuses like things like psychosocial risk assessment or psychosocial risk management has been a really good opportunity just to bring more people on that journey, demonstrate how to do it, learn from one another, the good and the bad, the what worked well, what didn't work so well, so that we can avoid some of those hurdles in the future. So I'm actually surprised by the openness in that space, but I think it's been a really positive outcome of bringing people together around these topics. And you certainly see there's certainly a lot more come back to the maturity point. I think the fact that we're able to share this and have conversations and see growing expertise based internally in large corporates around psych health and safety is not something I would have seen a few years ago.
And is that still open if, like, we've got listeners working for a large company and they want to join the Corporate Mental Health Alliance? Are other companies able to apply?
Yep, I believe so. I'm not the membership expert, so I won't pretend to know exactly the ins and outs of that. Yeah. So Kim, who is leading that, but obviously there's some huge corporates on the board of the CMHAA. It's a very inclusive approach to bringing corporate Australia on the journey. And so, yeah, I can definitely provide you with some links to share with listeners if they're interested. And the website itself has a number of great case studies that talks to what some of the different organisations are doing around psych health and safety.
Terrific. Now, we'll definitely put a link in the show notes for people listening to the podcast. Well, Laura, you've been working in this field for a long time. Like you say, even in the last 6 months, there's been, further changes in how we're doing workplace mental health that you've been able to observe. So looking forward, what would your hopes for the future of workplace mental health be?
So if I can talk blue sky for a minute.
Please do.
It's probably not dissimilar to a lot of your previous guests, and it's really just the elevation piece in that, I think we got to a point where physical health and safety was just an expected part of the way in which we manage and design our work. Ideally, we get to a point where psychological health and safety is recognised in the same vein, that we design work and manage work around psychological health and safety, that we understand job design and job crafting is an important part of people's work. So I think, to be taking more evidence-based approaches in this space. And I just, I talk to the concept of psych health and safety just being part and parcel of the way that we do our work. That is ideally where we get to. And I think the fact that we are still talking about them as separate concepts, or we're still talking about the integration piece, or how do we build this in the same way that WHS is more broadly, we've still got some way to go, obviously, in how we do this. But yeah, I think we're in the right direction. It's just we still need that elevation and better understanding that that the more that we design and support work in a psychologically healthy and safe way, the benefits from a physical and productivity perspective go alongside that.
Terrific.
Do you have some words of advice for professionals who would like to work in this field?
Please do. I think definitely. If people are interested, then I thoroughly encourage. I'm a huge advocate, obviously, of organisational psychology more broadly. So I'm always keen to talk to students who might be going into the psych space, and I regularly get people reach out for advice in this area, and I'm completely biased and encourage people to go down the org psych path. But I do think again, when I started org psych, no one knew what org psych was. No one had ever heard of that. And we're now actually in corporates talking about we need organizational psychology expertise for this. That's a huge movement in realistically a short period of time. So I'm certainly encouraged very early career psychs to consider this as a pathway, and perhaps use their supervision time as an opportunity to explore what this might look like, and get involved in different spaces around org psych. And increasingly people from non-psych backgrounds are asking about psych health and safety, and there's an interest in getting involved. And I encourage them to sort of look at some of the research, engage with available resources like this podcast, other mentors working in this space, just to understand a bit more about what they think is meant by psych health and safety, and get some of the foundational aspects under their belt, so that we can progress these conversations and just broaden the understanding of it more widely. So words of encouragement, if nothing else, but certainly to leverage some of the people who might already be working in the space, or leverage the resources that are out there to get involved.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Well, Laura, we have not been disappointed at all. It was well worth the wait.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry it took so long, and I'm very happy to talk anytime. It's one of my favourite topics, if you couldn't tell.
Okay, well, next week.
Regular weekly occurring spot. Wonderful.
You are a busy mum, 1 and 3-year-old, and taking on a C-level role at, a big Australian bank. So, no, we really appreciate your valuable time and your insights. I've been working in the area for 10 plus years. So really fantastic to hear from you today. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
So that brings us to the end of the show, listeners. So don't forget, if you prefer to watch the videos, as our friend Vince does, rather than listen to the podcast, then feel free to watch it on the Flourish DX YouTube channel. We will be doing little snippets from this Zoom call that we did recorded today, and we'll put them on the Flourish DX LinkedIn page. While you're on LinkedIn, Joelle and I will be there as well. So we're always there.
Always. We've got a schedule where there's never any time in a 24-hour period when one of us isn't on there.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. So you'll always be able to find one of the two of us. So please connect with us. And as Laura just said, for any aspiring psychologists or people wanting to work in the psych health and safety field, reach out to her. Now you're going to be inundated, Laura. I shouldn't have said that.
I don't think that was my call out, was it?
Laura wants to talk to you.
But you might have to wait 6 months like we did.
Yeah.
So,
We're also happy to talk to you, students.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end, listeners. Thanks again, and we'll catch you next episode. All done.